So I will start with a question. Yes, I will start with a question. So what was an author in the early modern period? Especially, what was an author of law books? If I could ask this question to one of my 16th century heroes, I would probably ask this question to him, Martin de Azpilcueta. You can see him here in the beautiful portrait that opens the 1584 French edition. I mean, it's in Latin, but it has been printed in France, of the manual, somehow celebrating with an image his authorship of the book. So some of you already know him. He was one of the most celebrated canon law professor of the 16th century and a crucial figure at the time, one of the most famous and mostly paid canon law professors in Salamanca first and in Coimbra then, and the reference point for the kings of Spain, Portugal, who had to face the different problems that the early global modern empires had to face. And from 1567 on, he was also a reference for the Pope, particularly when he moved to Rome following the Carranza trial and becoming a consultant of the Apostolic Penitentiary. So what made him famous were not the many erudite canon law books that came out from his university teaching, but mainly he was famous for his manual for confessors. This last one was a pragmatic book that immediately became a bestseller. A relatively small amount of the many editions of the book was supervised by him, and I will focus on this supervised edition in my talk. So these are the editions we will be quickly mentioning today. But the incredible number of edition, translation, and more importantly, compendia appeared and circulated all over the world beyond his control. And here you have an idea of the different places in which all these different products were printed. And if you maybe have a look at the little dot in Japan, you see that one edition of the compendium was also printed there. So if you want to know more about this global circulation and consumption of Azpilcueta's manual, and on the interactions between these dimensions, so this book, production, circulation, and consumption, and the production of normative knowledge at the time, you can wait a few more months and there will be a collective volume out. Yeah, so here, maybe very quickly, I can see them there. You have an idea of the different products I was talking about. So the manual itself and the compendia. Here you see, for example, in the 90s, a peak of production of the compendium. And here, if you want, we can get back later to these slides to understand a bit more the production of the manual and the other products. And here is a special slide for the compendium, and you see that the most published one was the one by Alagona. So if you're curious to know more about this global dimension of the manual, you wait a few more months and a book of the Max Planck studies in global legal history of the Iberian empires will be out. So if I had the chance to ask him, I'm sorry, I'm keeping moving and, okay. And I'm probably the smallest, so yeah, thanks. Okay, so if I would have the chance to ask him what was an author at his time, he would probably say that authorship was somehow that was not necessarily related to the authorial invention of a book, of a text, and somehow included different typologies of authorial relations to a text. But most importantly, he would probably say that authorship could clearly relate to commentary, improvement, addition to and transformation of someone else's text, and had a lot to do with the control over the publication and the circulation of a text. And here, my story is somehow similar to what has been told right now. So we cannot ask him, but what we can do is to somehow try to see him in action in the editorial system of the time. Because I think that looking at the author's place and somehow the authorial agency in this early modern editorial system is one interesting way to try to answer my question. So the case of Azpilcueta's manual and his complex and fascinating editorial history allows us to see in action some of the features of the complex and specific operations which stood behind the construction of what Michel Foucault called the author function in the early modern period, with specific regard to law books. So this operation, as I said, were related to my eyes to the author agency and control in the process of production and circulation of the book. So it was especially through the expert use of the legal tool of the privilege of print, of the printing privilege granted by the authorities to the authors, and through the active role in the networks of book production and circulation, that Azpilcueta first constructs his authorship. And we will see in a moment in which sense. And at the same time, it's also via these privileges that he is trying to control the production and the circulation of his book. So in Azpilcueta's case, as I said, the privileges are used, first of all, to construct the authorship and to control the production and the circulation. And these two elements would be the main points of my talk. I won't go over the editorial history, so if you have questions on that, we can just keep talking after. What I would like to stress is the starting point of the story, and you probably have it here. So the starting point is the 1549 Coimbra edition, and the most intriguing point of this edition is that it was not written by Azpilcueta. So this book, the author of this book was an anonymous Franciscan friar from the Provincia da Piedade, who was extremely humble and preferred not to be named. So we know that it was the king's brother and the General Inquisitor of Portugal who asked Azpilcueta to check the text and to publish it. So he revised the text and added an introduction containing the explanation of about 90 unclear passages of the manual. And here starts the intellectual process of revision, enrichment, transformation, and translation of the manual, first into Spanish and then into Latin by Azpilcueta himself. So this process will accompany him until the end of his life, making the handbook to become more and more his most successful book. So Azpilcueta was not the author of the text printed in 1549, but year after year and through this transformation process, he becomes the author of another bigger and more erudite book, which is the Spanish edition of our manual, and we will see that in a second. So, maybe I can just move, and here you have, quickly the edition that I mentioned, through which he is adding new parts and transforming the text, and this deleted one. So, first of all, in the paratext, and maybe in the dedication to the reader, we see a specific, somehow, narrative of this progressive construction of the authorship. No, here is not exactly where I wanted you to go. So let's see if I'm able to. Okay, yeah, it's here. So, as I said, through the different editions and in the different dedication to the readers, we can really appreciate a different level of authorship that is claimed by Azpilcueta. So in the first edition, the authorship is he fully stresses that the author is the Franciscan friar. He is only somehow giving his authority to the text. Starting from the 1552 edition, the authority, the fact of giving his authority to the text, is made in a more complex and somehow richer way. So his authorial contribution is not anymore to the simple work of checking the text, but he really stresses the important work of transformation, modification, improvement, and then translation of the text. The turning point is the 1556 edition in Spanish, the second Spanish edition, in which he really stresses and marks the difference from the departing text, the 1549 book in Portuguese, and this 1556 Spanish big and erudite book. So here, also in his narrative, something really changes. And this authorial awareness is even stronger in the Latin edition, where he really presents himself using the word author. So he stresses that for the 1556 previous transformation, he corrected, reformed, and augmented the book, but in this case, for this Latin transformation, he, as the author of this 1556 book, was the only one who had the knowledge to translate and further improve the text. So how can we explain this clear change in the authorial narrative in the paratext? So between, let's say, before the 1556 edition, something changes, something happens, and in particular, a Spanish printer, and here we go to the next, Juan María de Terranova, together with other printer, prints a pirate edition of the manual. And this edition is, of course, a starting point of a lawsuit that runs between March 1554 and June 1555. And this was one of the most striking conflicts between authors and booksellers and printers that happened before the royal courts in the Siglo de Oro. So the core question at stake is the authorship of the book, acknowledged and protected by a privilege of print that Philip II granted to Azpilcueta in 1554. So Azpilcueta's authorship, together with the legitimacy of the king's privileges, were both strongly contested and questioned by Terranova. And for this reason, we can somehow split our story now into parts. So before the sentence and after the sentence. And we will see that the authorial strategy changes between these two moments. So this litigation, this lawsuit, I've been working on the cartas ejecutoria, are incredible, extraordinary sources to understand the specificities of the early modern notion of authorship in general and of authorship of law books in particular, and the defining role of the printing privileges granted to author in this definition. So in these sources, we can really appreciate Azpilcueta's own voice, and it's not really often that we have this chance in defining his authorial work in the transformation, revision, and translations of the departing Portuguese text. So which are the main arguments that Azpilcueta is stressing? First of all, the great amount of work and of the intellectual process of revising and reworking the anonymous friar's book. And this was a substantial intellectual work, which was somehow deeply rooted in the legal intellectual work, traditionally made by specific activities like the interpretation or the comment on authoritative text. The second point is the language issue. So he really stresses that the departing text was in Portuguese, and what he worked on and transformed was in the end a Spanish text. And he also stresses that he added some new parts to the text. And I was quite happy to read that, because it was exactly the same kind of dynamics that I'm trying to track with the digital project, in which I'm really trying to compare this edition and this authorial transformation. And he was somehow confirming my first guess already. The lawsuit is very interesting because we can also hear Charles V's own voice. So he follows and buys Azpilcueta's argument. And about the printing privilege contested in the trial and previously granted to Azpilcueta, he stresses that this was granted to acknowledge this huge amount of work and substantial improvement. And we also appreciate Charles V's direct involvement in the edition. So he gave a specific mandate to Azpilcueta for this work, because he wanted this book to be printed in his kingdom. There is also an interesting economic note. I will go quickly now, then if you want, I can say a few more words later. The costs were covered by Azpilcueta himself. And one of the reasons that he gave for the importance of this privilege was that he, by controlling these dynamics, he could have done what he always did with his book. That means offering as gifts several of these copies to clerks and poor students, and also making in sort that the book was not sold at a higher price. So for this reason, he already entrusted an agent and asked him to sell the edition at less than half ducat each, and then I will need to ask Renaud for the value and just to understand what we are talking about this difference in prices, because yeah, I really need your help here. While Terranova already sold it at 7 or 8 reales. So here's really stressing this different. It goes with no surprise that with the sentence Azpilcueta is formally acknowledged and declared as the author of the Spanish manual. And somehow this idea that authorship was also related to the transformation and improvement of someone else's text somehow is confirmed and passes. Here starts the second part, the second half time of the story. That happens after the sentence is pronounced and is related to the very intense activity that Azpilcueta is putting in place for really collecting strategically a lot of printing privileges aiming at controlling the production and circulation of the book continuously for more than 30 years. He always asks for the renovation of a privilege when the privilege is about to expire, for example, and covering more and more territories. So here you can have an idea. So he starts already during the trial in collecting privileges for the Iberian Peninsula. Then when he moves to Rome, he asks the Pope for the privilege of print, and this is the moment in which the Latin edition appears. Then, of course, he thinks about Venice, and there is a collection also of printing privileges in Venice. Antwerp, via, of course, Philip II. And finally, France. So this is somehow where he wants to go. And here, I'm sorry, the slide is really kind of ugly compared to the very beautiful slides that I've seen today and yesterday. But here you have an idea also of the time span and this constant attempt to cover all and to get the privilege renovated. So in blue, you see the privileges that he is asking and obtaining for the Iberian Peninsula. Then this strategy related to the Iberian Peninsula continues in the 60s. So when the first privileges were about to expire, he asks and obtains other privileges for the Spanish edition and for the Iberian Peninsula, and also in the 1570. In the meantime, as I said, Azpilcueta moved to Rome, so for the Latin text, the Latin edition, he asks for the papal privilege, and this is the moment in which he is also asking other privileges like to Florence, but they are not reproduced in the text, while all the privileges that I'm mentioning here are reproduced in the edition as well. So, yeah, thanks. Quickly, green are the papal privileges. Red is the Venetian one, so you also see the continuity of these two, even though for Venice, it seems that the first one was not really used, or at least is not reproduced in the Latin edition printed later in Venice. Interestingly, in 1574, he also obtains privileges from the King of Spain for printing the Latin edition, but this, in this case, the choice goes to Plantin. So the Latin edition by Plantin is also covered by a printing privilege, and there is a very interesting correspondence between Azpilcueta and Plantin that make us understand how much in depth he really wants to control even the agents that Plantin uses for the circulation of the book. Then 1580 is another printing privilege by the Pope. And as I said, in yellow, 1582, he also gets a printing privilege for printing the Latin edition in France. So just to have a very quick look at what happens in 1584, which is very interesting to my eyes. And here you have just, I try to connect privileges and edition. So in 1584, he prints, there is a Latin edition printed in Rome by Giorgio Ferrari and Vincenzo Colti. Same year in Venice, Francesco Ziletti and Domenico Giovanbattista Guerra. And in Lyon by Guyen Rouillet. So this is really a moment in which he combines also in all this edition the papal privilege with the privilege of the political, the secular authority. So really, one word to conclude. I try to summarize this control strategy. So first of all, he tries to get a printing privilege for every new revision of the manual, asking for an extension of the previous privileges. Then he entrusts simultaneously, and here you get my conclusion, simultaneously several printers active in different territories for the same edition. So about authorship, I think that it was also, and here we have like an example related to the authorial transformation, and had to do with the agency of the author in the editorial system. The privileges were key tools in this process. And I will just close with an open question which came out from the discussion that I had with Andrea. So this improvement of the strategy, going really on a vast territory, starts when he moves to Rome. So is that he is somehow spreading and using the model of the papal privilege also in different territories? So this is more or less what I wanted to say. Thank you.